Sheriff Walter Briggs couldn't have known, as he stood before the rusted gates of the Mojave Industrial Complex, that he was staring at the largest unmarked mass grave on American soil. Behind him, the desert stretched for 60 miles in every direction, a sea of sand and sage that had conspired with ambition and wartime secrecy to create something monstrous. Ahead, through the morning haze, the skeletal remains of factory buildings clawed at the sky like the ribs of some prehistoric beast. Between the two lay 18 months of silence, during which 47 men had vanished without a single family asking why. The complex had appeared almost overnight in early 1942, 3 months after Pearl Harbor. The federal government, through agencies whose acronyms changed weekly, had purchased 8,000 acres of worthless desert for what they called critical war production. No one questioned it. Patriots didn't question. They built. Within 6 months, the Mojave Industrial Complex employed 3,000 workers across 3 shifts, manufacturing aircraft components that would, according to the carefully worded press releases, bring our boys home faster. The location was strategic, 180 miles from Los Angeles, 90 miles from the nearest town of Baker, connected only by a single-lane road that the Army Corps of Engineers had carved through the Mojave like a scar. Workers lived on-site in prefabricated barracks. Mail came twice weekly. Telephone lines reached the complex in August 1942, but only to the administrative building. The foreman called it security. The workers called it prison. Dr. Marcus Webb had arrived in September 1942, credentials impeccable, bearing letters from Washington that made local administrators stand straighter. He was 46 years old, tall and thin as a rail spike, with pale eyes that never seemed to blink and hands that were always cold. Even workers who shook them in the California heat would later remember the chill. He'd studied at Johns Hopkins, served in the Great War as a field surgeon, published papers on trauma adaptation and pain threshold variance in extreme conditions that made medical journals uncomfortable but couldn't be ignored. His official role was Chief Medical Officer, treating the inevitable injuries that came with round-the-clock industrial work. His unofficial role, documented in letters he wrote to unnamed colleagues in Washington, was something else entirely. The complex ran 3 shifts, day, 6 a.m. to 2 p.m., swing, 2 p.m. to 10 p.m., and graveyard, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. It was the graveyard shift that interested Dr. Webb. The first to disappear was Thomas Keller, 34, on November 3, 1942. A welder from Oklahoma, married with 2 daughters he kept photographs of in his shirt pocket. He'd written home faithfully every week, letters full of pride about helping beat the Japs and questions about how the wheat harvest had gone. Then his letters stopped. His foreman noted him as transferred to Special Projects, Building 7, on November 3. His wife's letters, asking why he'd stopped writing, were returned marked employee no longer at this location. No one from Oklahoma came looking. Gas was rationed. Phone calls were expensive. And the government had explained, in stern language that implied patriotism demanded silence, that some war work was too sensitive to discuss. Building 7 sat at the northwest corner of the complex, 400 yards from the nearest other structure. It was smaller than the main production facilities, only 60 feet by 40 feet, but it had been built with poured concrete walls 18 inches thick. Workers noticed it had no windows. They noticed that trucks arrived at Building 7 in the middle of the night, covered with tarps, headlights off until they were inside the compound. They noticed that Dr. Webb spent most of his time there, arriving before dawn and leaving after dark, his medical bag always full, always heavy. What they didn't notice, because isolation and exhaustion and the constant roar of machinery made men stop noticing things, was the pattern. Every 4 to 6 weeks, a worker from the graveyard shift would be marked transferred. Always men between 28 and 40. Always men without local family. Always men whose next of kin lived at least 3 states away. And always men who had recently visited the medical clinic with injuries. Nothing serious, just bad enough to require examination. By March 1943, The complex was producing aircraft components at a rate that impressed even the skeptics in Washington. Aluminum struts emerged from the foundries every 8 minutes. Hydraulic systems were assembled, tested, and shipped in batches of 50 per week. And in Building 7, Dr. Marcus Webb was conducting research that he documented with the meticulous care of a man who believed himself to be serving a greater good. His journals, discovered later sealed in a lead-lined box buried beneath the building's foundation, began with a quote from Francis Bacon, "Knowledge itself is power." The second entry, dated September 18, 1942, laid out his hypothesis. War demands men operate beyond normal human limitations. Sleep deprivation, extreme heat, sustained physical trauma, these are constants of modern combat. Yet we send men to battle without understanding the breaking points of human physiology. If we understood where the body fails, we could engineer soldiers to surpass these limitations. The Soviets are doing it. The Germans certainly are. We must not fall behind. The third entry, dated November 4, 1942, one day after Thomas Keller's transfer, contained measurements: height, weight, resting heart rate, pain response to electrical stimulus, hours until unconsciousness under various conditions of stress. By spring 1943, Dr. Webb had refined his methodology. The graveyard shift workers were ideal subjects, isolated, exhausted, far from oversight. A minor injury during their shift was easily treated in the clinic. A sedative mixed with standard pain medication went unnoticed, and the walk from the clinic to Building 7, supported by an orderly who was paid triple wage and asked no questions, could be explained as observation for shock. The complex's location made everything possible. Federal land stretched in every direction. The nearest sheriff was in Baker, 90 miles away, and he'd been told explicitly that the complex fell under military jurisdiction. Mail was censored for security. Telephone access was restricted. And every worker had signed documents, thick stacks of them on their first day, that mentioned penalties for discussing their work, including imprisonment for violations of the Espionage Act. Isolation conspired with patriotism to create perfect silence. Would you like me to continue with chapters 2, 3, and 4? This will be a complete 13 to 17-minute historical horror story following all the parameters from your document. Lieutenant James Thornton, 38, hadn't planned to become an investigator. He'd planned to die in the Pacific. Most Marines who survived Guadalcanal expected as much. But shrapnel had torn through his left knee in a way that ended combat service while leaving him functional enough for essential war work stateside. The limp was permanent. The nightmares were worse. And the methodical mind that had kept him alive through 3 island campaigns now had nowhere to focus except patterns in paperwork. His official role was Personnel Coordinator, Western Manufacturing Division, a desk job in a Los Angeles office that processed transfer orders, injury reports, and termination paperwork for 17 defense contractors scattered across California, Nevada, and Arizona. It was the kind of work designed to be invisible. Rubber stamping forms, filing reports, making sure the machinery of war production had adequate human fuel. He noticed the discrepancy in May 1943, 6 months into the job. The Mojave Industrial Complex had a worker turnover rate of 4.7% monthly, 47 men per 1,000 employees. Industry average for similar facilities was 2.1%. The difference seemed minor until Thornton, trained to see terrain where others saw only jungle, mapped it across time. In 8 months, 141 workers had been transferred from Mojave. 0 had been transferred to Mojave from other facilities. The complex was a black hole, consuming men without replacement. He wrote a memo. It was filed without response. He wrote another in July, this one noting that 87% of transfers came from the graveyard shift, a statistical impossibility if transfers were random. Still no response, but this time a note appeared in his personnel file. Lieutenant Thornton reminds that wartime production requires discretion regarding operational details above his clearance level. In August 1943, Thornton drove to Baker, California on his weekend leave. It took 7 hours. The town, if you could call it that, consisted of a general store, a gas station, a diner, and a sheriff's office that served 3 counties totaling 11,000 square miles. Sheriff Walter Briggs, 52, had held the position for 19 years. He knew every prospector, every rancher, every drifter in his territory. He also knew when to ask questions and when to accept that some things were federal business. The Mojave Complex? Briggs leaned back in his chair, which creaked like it had been creaking since Hoover was president. Hell of an operation. Sprang up like a mushroom after Pearl Harbor. Employ near 3,000 men, I hear. Don't get much trouble from 'em. Can't, really, since they don't leave the compound except in groups, and those groups go straight to Barstow for supplies, don't stop here. You ever get inquiries about workers? Thornton kept his tone casual. Family members trying to locate someone? Few times. Briggs scratched his jaw. Wives wondering why letters stopped. Told them to contact the complex directly. Federal facility, outside my jurisdiction. You know how it is. And they were satisfied with that? Mister, it's 1943. Everybody's got somebody who stopped writing. War does that. Folks assume their husband or brother or son got shipped to the Pacific or Alaska or some other godforsaken place the government won't talk about. They don't come knocking on my door twice. Thornton drove the final 90 miles to the complex. The road was worse than military maps suggested, barely paved, washboard by trucks, shimmering in heat that made the air dance. He counted 17 miles between the last sign of human habitation and the complex gates. In that emptiness, a man could scream for days without being heard. The guard at the gate checked Thornton's credentials 3 times. Made 2 phone calls. Finally waved him through to the administrative building, where he waited 45 minutes before meeting Assistant Director Harold Price, a bureaucrat who'd probably never seen a factory floor but had mastered the art of saying nothing in many words. Lieutenant, your concern for production efficiency is noted and appreciated. Price smiled like a mannequin. However, the transfer protocols at Mojave are classified under wartime production security. What I can tell you is that certain highly skilled workers are frequently requisitioned for specialized projects. The paperwork reflects standard procedures. Where are they transferred to? I'm not at liberty to discuss project locations. Then give me names. I'll verify they arrived at their new assignments. Price's smile never wavered. That would require clearances you don't possess. Now, if you'll excuse me, production quotas wait for no man, not even decorated Marines. Thornton limped back to his car, knee aching from the long drive, and noticed something that hadn't registered on arrival. The complex had its own cemetery. Small, fenced, marked with white crosses. He counted 23 graves. Industrial accidents, presumably. The complex was dangerous work. Molten metal, heavy presses, caustic chemicals. Men died in factories. It was expected. What wasn't expected was the small notation he found 6 weeks later, buried in a medical examiner's report from San Bernardino County. In March 1943, the body of a man identified as John Doe No. 47 had been found in the desert 18 miles from the Mojave complex. Severe dehydration. Exposure. But also, evidence of recent surgical incisions, partially healed. Evidence of malnutrition inconsistent with a worker employed at a federal facility. And evidence, noted but not emphasized in the report, of electrical burns in patterns the examiner described as not consistent with industrial accident. The body had been buried in the county cemetery. No one claimed it. The complex, when contacted, confirmed they'd had no workers go missing. Case closed. Thornton requested the physical description. Male, approximately 35 to 40 years old, 5 feet 10 inches, brown hair, distinguishing marks including a tattoo on the left forearm, an anchor and the letters USN. He cross-referenced it against transfer records. In February 1943, a graveyard shift worker named William Holbrook, former Navy, 37 years old, 5 feet 10 inches, documented tattoo matching the description, had been transferred to special projects. Thornton wrote another memo, this time directly to his commanding officer, laying out the evidence. 3 days later, he was called into an office he'd never visited before, where a man in civilian clothes who never gave his name explained in very clear terms that the Mojave Industrial Complex was producing components critical to bomber production. Bomber production was critical to winning the war. Anything that disrupted bomber production helped the enemy. Lieutenant Thornton seemed like a patriotic man who wouldn't want to help the enemy. Perhaps Lieutenant Thornton's combat trauma was manifesting as paranoid obsession. Perhaps Lieutenant Thornton should take medical leave to address this. These were suggestions, not orders, but they should be taken very seriously. Thornton took 2 weeks' leave. Spent it in the Los Angeles Public Library, reading everything he could find about Dr. Marcus Webb. The publications were impressive. 17 papers in medical journals between 1927 and 1941. Early work focused on battlefield trauma, how to keep soldiers alive long enough to reach proper facilities. Then a shift around 1935, papers on voluntary pain tolerance, consciousness under extreme stress, pharmaceutical enhancement of endurance. The language was clinical, academic, but between the lines Thornton read something that made his hands shake. Curiosity about what human beings could survive with the right methodology. Webb's final published paper, from 1941, months before Pearl Harbor, concluded, the coming conflict will demand physical capabilities beyond current human norms. Only through systematic research can we determine the true boundaries of human endurance, and thus learn to extend them. The paper had been published in the Journal of Military Medicine. It had been controversial enough that the journal printed 3 responses criticizing Webb's methodology as ethically questionable. Webb's rebuttal cited German and Soviet research, arguing that America couldn't afford squeamishness when enemies were advancing human performance through aggressive experimentation. 6 months later, Webb had vanished from academic publishing. 8 months later, he'd surfaced at the Mojave Industrial Complex. In December 1943, Thornton received a letter, no return address, postmarked Barstow. Handwritten on lined paper torn from a notebook. Lieutenant, if you're still asking questions about Mojave, you should know, I worked there 8 months, graveyard shift. Saw things. Men go to the clinic, don't come back. Building 7 has screams at night. You can hear them if you're outside and the wind is right. Dr. Webb watches the graveyard shift like he's shopping. My friend Martinez said the orderly offered him triple wages to help move patients, but he'd have to sign papers saying he'd never talk about what he saw. Martinez didn't take it. Week later, Martinez transferred. I got scared. Quit in November. Foreman didn't fight it, seemed relieved. I signed papers that said I'd go to prison if I ever discussed my work. But men are dying in there. Somebody needs to know. The letter was unsigned. Thornton drove back to Baker in February 1944, showed Sheriff Briggs everything he'd compiled. Briggs listened, studied the documents, and finally said, I believe you. But believing you and having jurisdiction are different things. That's federal land. Complex has its own security. I show up with a warrant. Even if I could get one, I'd be turned away at the gate and probably arrested for interfering with war production. Then what do? We need evidence that gives us cause to enter. Evidence that can't be dismissed as classified war work. We need a witness who'll testify publicly, or a body we can prove came from inside, or... Briggs stopped, looked out the window at the desert stretching endlessly. Or we need someone to escape. Samuel Morrison stumbled into Baker on foot, having crawled 23 miles through desert that should have killed him. He was 33 years old but looked 60. Weight had dropped from 180 to maybe 110 pounds. Skin hung loose, translucent in places where veins showed through like blue wires. His left arm terminated at the elbow, not cleanly amputated, but crudely severed and cauterized with what looked like a welding torch. Both feet were wrapped in strips of cloth that had once been a shirt, soaked through with blood and seeping fluid from infections that had gone untreated for weeks. But it was his eyes that made Sheriff Briggs pour coffee with shaking hands. They were the eyes of a man who'd seen his own death many times and survived it. Morrison couldn't speak at first. His tongue was swollen, lips cracked and bleeding from dehydration. Briggs gave him water slowly, spoonfuls at a time, the way you'd water a plant that hadn't seen rain in months. It took 3 hours before Morrison could form words. 2 more before he could form sentences. And even then, what came out was fractured, jumping between moments like a broken film reel. Thornton had arrived in Baker that morning. He'd been coming every few weeks, coordinating with Briggs, waiting for the break that would give them cause. He sat across from Morrison in the sheriff's office, notepad ready, and tried to assemble coherence from trauma. "March," Morrison whispered. "Crushed my hand in the press. 3 fingers. Went to the clinic. Dr. Webb, cold hands, gave me something for pain. Woke up in Building 7. You woke up in Building 7? Thornton kept his voice level. Underground. Didn't know there was underground. Thought it was just one building. But there's levels. 3 levels down. Maybe more. I only saw 3. He drank more water. Briggs had called Dr. Henderson, the town's only physician, who arrived at 2 a.m. with his bag and a look of professional horror as he examined Morrison. "This man needs a hospital," Henderson said quietly. "These infections." "After he tells us what happened," Thornton said. "Before they come looking for him." Morrison talked for 4 hours, between sips of water and moments when his mind seemed to leave entirely, staring at walls like he was seeing through them to places no one else could see. The story that emerged. Building 7's ground floor was legitimate, a medical observation facility where workers with serious injuries could be monitored before being transported to proper hospitals. It had 6 beds, basic equipment, 1 nurse who worked days. Dr. Webb maintained an office there. But beneath the ground floor, accessible through what looked like a supply closet, concrete stairs descended into the earth. The complex had been built on sandstone, soft enough to excavate, hard enough to hold shape without reinforcement. Webb had brought in crews from the Los Angeles construction project. Mexican laborers who were paid cash, didn't speak much English, and were bussed back to L.A. after 3 months of digging. They'd carved out chambers that the official building plans never mentioned. Level 1, 15 feet down. 10 cells, each 8 feet by 6 feet, carved directly from stone. Iron doors salvaged from a decommissioned prison in Arizona. Each cell had a cot, a bucket, and chains bolted to the wall. When Morrison arrived, 6 cells were occupied. "Men from the graveyard shift," Morrison said. Recognized 2 of them, Williams and Chen. Thought they'd been transferred. They'd been down there for, Williams said, 3 months. Chen didn't talk anymore. Just sat there. Dr. Webb visited twice daily, morning and evening. Always with his black medical bag. Always with his journal. He would examine each prisoner, temperature, pulse, pupil dilation, reflex responses. He would inject them with compounds from unmarked vials. He would observe the effects, increased heart rate, muscle spasms, projectile vomiting, seizures, unconsciousness. He would take notes in handwriting so precise it looked like typewriter text. He'd explain what he was doing. Morrison's voice was flat, effect gone. Like teaching medical students. Compound 17 shows promise for sustained alertness, but cardiovascular strain remains problematic. That's what he said while Williams was having a heart attack. Just noted the time. Checked his pulse. Waited to see if he'd survive. He did. Webb noted that too. Level 2, 30 feet down. This was the surgical theater. A proper operating table, electric lights powered by a generator that Morrison could hear humming constantly. Surgical tools arranged on steel trays with the precision of a man who took pride in his work. And equipment that Henderson, listening to the description, identified as modified dental drills, electroshock therapy apparatus, and something that sounded like primitive dialysis machinery. "He'd bring us down one at a time," Morrison said. "The orderly big guy named Kovac barely spoke English. He'd bring you down strapped to a gurney. Webb would already be there, scrubbed, ready. He'd explain what he was testing. Pain threshold, he called it. How much electrical current human nervous system could withstand. How long consciousness could be maintained under various forms of trauma. How quickly wounds healed under different pharmaceutical protocols." Morrison stopped, stared at his missing forearm. "He took my arm in July. Said he needed to understand amputation trauma and infection management without antibiotics. Battlefield conditions, he called it. Used a surgical saw. Very precise. Cauterized it with a torch to simulate artillery wounds. Then he documented healing rates with no treatment. Measured pain levels every 6 hours. I was screaming so much he gagged me. Kovac would just stand there, watching. Webb would say, 'Note, subject maintains consciousness even at pain level estimated 9.7. Dr. Henderson had gone pale. "This man needs morphine." "Now." "Not yet," Thornton said quietly. "Samuel, did you see level 3? Morrison nodded. "Once. Door was open when Kovac brought me back from surgery. Saw inside. Level 3, 50 feet down, the disposal chamber. Bodies," Morrison whispered. "Concrete vault. 20, 30 bodies. Some recent. Some just bones. Webb kept them for study," he said. "Documented decomposition rates in desert conditions. Took tissue samples. He had jars, preserved organs labeled with dates and subject numbers. There was a furnace, too. Kovac would burn the ones Webb was done studying." "How many men were down there when you escaped?" Briggs asked. 8 of us on level 1. Webb said we were his long-term subjects, men who'd survived multiple protocols. He wanted to see how much cumulative trauma human body could endure. Chen died in August. Webb documented it. Kovac dragged him to level 3. Week later, there was another new guy, Davis, I think. Never really talked. "How did you escape?" Webb left door unsealed on September 2nd. Not unlocked, but the bolt was off. I don't know if it was carelessness or he wanted to see what would happen. I waited 2 days. Listened to patterns. Webb came at 8 a.m. and 6 p.m., always exactly. Kovac made rounds every 3 hours. On the 4th, at midnight, I picked the lock with a wire from my cot spring. Got past Kovac while he was on level 2. Ground floor was empty at night. Found a door. And I ran. 23 miles through desert, with those injuries? Henderson sounded incredulous. I crawled half of it. Morrison looked at his hands, torn and bloody. Knew if I stopped I'd die. Knew if they caught me I'd go back down. So I crawled. Drank from a creek. Walked when I could. Took 3 nights. Thornton and Briggs exchanged looks. "We need to move now," Thornton said, "before they realize he's gone and destroy evidence." Briggs nodded. "I'll call the FBI field office in Los Angeles. This is beyond sheriff jurisdiction." "They won't believe us," Thornton said. "Webb has federal protection. We need leverage." Morrison spoke up, voice stronger now. "His journal. He keeps it in his office, locked drawer in his desk. Documents everything. Every man, every experiment, every result. That's your evidence." September 8, 1944. 6:15 a.m. Thornton stood once again before the gates of the Mojave Industrial Complex, but this time Sheriff Briggs stood beside him. Behind them, 4 FBI agents, 3 federal marshals, and a warrant signed by a judge who'd read Dr. Henderson's medical report on Samuel Morrison and decided that national security didn't excuse torture. The guard at the gate made one phone call. Then he opened the gates without a word. Assistant Director Price met them in the administrative building, face carefully neutral. "Gentlemen, I assure you there's been some misunderstanding." "Where is Dr. Webb?" Thornton asked. "Dr. Webb hasn't reported for duty in 3 days. We assumed he was ill." They found Building 7 locked. Broke the door. The ground floor was exactly as Morrison described. Medical facility, legitimate equipment, Webb's office. The locked drawer in his desk surrendered to a crowbar. Inside, 3 journals, bound in black leather, each page filled with Webb's meticulous handwriting. Lead FBI agent Thomas Crawford opened the first journal, read for 30 seconds, and went pale. Jesus Christ. The supply closet door was hidden behind a rolling cabinet. Behind it, concrete stairs descending into darkness lit only by bare bulbs strung on wires. They found level 1 empty. All cell doors open. Fresh blood on the floor of 3 cells. Evidence of hasty evacuation, abandoned possessions, medical instruments left behind. Level 2 still had the surgical theater intact, operating table with leather restraints, trays of instruments, the modified dental drill, and on the wall, a chart documenting pain threshold experiments, March 1943 to September 1944, with names, dates, procedures, and results written in columns. Level 3 made 2 of the federal marshals vomit. The concrete vault contained 28 bodies in various states of decomposition. The preservation jars held organs labeled with clinical precision, Subject 17, liver, post-compound 23 exposure, and Subject 31, cardiac tissue, electrical trauma study. The furnace was cold but contained bone fragments and ash. Against the far wall, they found a steel cabinet. Inside, medical files on 47 men, each with photographs, physical measurements, experiment logs, and, in 11 cases, death certificates that had never been filed with any official agency. Dr. Marcus Webb was never found. His car was discovered September 10th, abandoned in Barstow. Witnesses reported seeing a tall, thin man board a bus heading east on September 5th, the day after Morrison escaped. The FBI tracked him to Denver, then to Chicago, then lost the trail. Kovac, the orderly, was found dead in his quarters on September 7th. Single gunshot wound to the head, self-inflicted according to the angle, though no note was left. Of the 7 men Morrison reported seeing in the cells, 4 were found wandering the complex grounds in states of severe malnutrition and psychological trauma. 3 were never accounted for, presumed killed and destroyed when Webb evacuated. The Mojave Industrial Complex continued operating until November 1945. Building 7 was demolished in October 1944, the subterranean levels filled with concrete that was poured continuously for 3 days until the chambers were sealed entirely. Official records listed it as structural remediation of earthquake damage. Samuel Morrison survived 9 more months. Dr. Henderson fought the infections, but between the malnutrition, the untreated trauma, and what Henderson privately called a soul that had endured more than bodies are meant to endure, Morrison died in May 1945. His last words, according to the nurse present, were, "Count them. All of them. Make sure they're counted." The 4 survivors removed from the complex were transported to a psychiatric facility in San Diego operated by the Veterans Administration. All 4 were ruled permanently disabled. 2 died within a year, one from pneumonia his ravaged immune system couldn't fight, another from suicide. The remaining 2 lived into the 1960s, neither able to hold employment or maintain relationships. One gave a single interview in 1963 to a journalist who'd heard rumors about Mojave. The article was never published. the journalist's editor received calls from Washington making clear that publication would result in Espionage Act charges. The complex itself continued production until war's end. Workers were told that Building 7 had been damaged in an accident and was being repaired. No one asked questions. In the context of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, both bombed in August 1945, the revelation that scientists had done terrible things in the name of winning seemed almost expected. The war had normalized horror. After VJ Day, the complex was decommissioned. Equipment was sold as surplus. Buildings were stripped. By 1947, the site was abandoned. 8,000 acres of desert that the federal government no longer needed. Environmental cleanup, such as it was in 1947, took 6 months. Then the land was sold to a developer for $1.50 per acre with the stipulation that no structures could be built on the northwest corner, where Building 7 had stood. The developer went bankrupt in 1952. The land reverted to federal control. In 1968, it became part of the Mojave National Preserve. Today, it's empty desert that hikers occasionally cross, noticing only that there's a section where concrete rubble pokes through sand and sagebrush has grown in patterns that suggest buried structures beneath. The official investigation, such as it was, resulted in classified reports that remained sealed until 1994, when a Freedom of Information Act request forced partial disclosure. The released documents were heavily redacted. What remained confirmed that unauthorized medical experimentation had occurred at the Mojave Industrial Complex between 1942 and 1944, that Dr. Marcus Webb had been the primary investigator, and that between 28 and 47 individuals had been subjected to procedures that violated medical ethics and military regulations. The documents noted that Dr. Webb had never been apprehended. A warrant remained active until 1974, when he would have been 78 years old and was presumed dead. There were unconfirmed sightings over the years, a doctor matching his description working in a South American clinic in 1951, a researcher at a Canadian pharmaceutical company in 1958, but none were verified. The men who died in Building 7 received official recognition in 1996, when the Veterans Administration erected a small monument in the Riverside National Cemetery. It lists 47 names under the heading, "In memory of those who gave more than country should have asked." 28 of the names are marked with asterisks, indicating remains recovered and identified. 19 have no asterisks, bodies that were never found, destroyed too completely in Webb's furnace to identify, or disposed of in ways the investigation never uncovered. The journals, 3 volumes totaling 847 pages, were classified as evidence and sealed. They remained sealed until 1997, when historian Dr. Sarah Chen obtained access for her doctoral dissertation. She spent 6 months reading them, emerging with what colleagues described as profound psychological distress, and a 400-page dissertation that concluded, Dr. Marcus Webb believed himself a patriot. His journals contain no expressions of sadism, no evidence of pleasure in suffering. Instead, they read as the work of a scientist convinced that his research, however terrible, served a greater good. He genuinely believed that understanding human limits would save American lives in combat. This makes his work more horrifying, not less. The monsters who believe themselves heroes are the ones we fail to see coming. The case changed military medical ethics. The Nuremberg Code, established in 1947 after Nazi medical experiments were revealed at trial, cited the Mojave Complex as evidence that atrocity wasn't limited to enemy nations. The Nuremberg principles of informed consent, voluntary participation, and prohibition of experiments causing death or disability became U.S. military law in 1953. But enforcement was another matter. In 1994, President Clinton formed the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments to investigate Cold War-era medical testing. Their final report documented 4,000 experiments on American citizens between 1944 and 1974. Many without consent, many on vulnerable populations, many causing permanent harm. The Mojave Complex wasn't unique. It was simply documented. Today, Lieutenant James Thornton received a commendation in 1945 for exceptional devotion to duty in uncovering violations of military law. He returned to civilian life, worked as an investigator for the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office, and died in 1971 at age 66. His obituary made no mention of Mojave. His daughter, interviewed in 2003, said he'd had nightmares for decades, not about Guadalcanal, but about Building 7. Sheriff Walter Briggs continued serving Kern County until his retirement in 1961. He never discussed the case publicly. A journal found after his death in 1967 contained a single entry about Mojave. "I've seen bad men. Webb wasn't bad. He was worse, a man who thought torture was science and called it progress. I pray he's dead. I pray harder that he died knowing what he was." Dr. Henderson testified before a military tribunal in 1945. The testimony remained classified for 50 years. When released, it included his assessment of Morrison's injuries, consistent with systematic torture over approximately 4 months. Multiple healed fractures, evidence of repeated electrical burns, malnutrition consistent with controlled starvation, and psychological trauma severe enough to classify as inhumane treatment under any interpretation of military or civilian law. The Mojave Industrial Complex produced 1.4 million aircraft components during its operational life. Those components went into B-29 bombers, P-51 fighters, C-47 transports. They helped win the war. Workers there, the 3,000 who weren't selected for Building 7, believed they were patriots. They were. But 47 other men, chosen for nothing except isolation from family and vulnerability to disappearance, served a different purpose. They became subjects in research that their country sanctioned through willful ignorance, protected through classification, and finally acknowledged only when evidence became impossible to deny. The final count. 47 men entered Building 7 between November 1942 and September 1944. 28 bodies were recovered. 19 were never found. 4 survived long enough to be rescued. None survived long enough to fully recover. One man, Samuel Morrison, lived long enough to tell the truth. One man, Dr. Marcus Webb, escaped justice entirely and may have died peacefully in old age, journals destroyed, conscience untroubled by belief that he'd served a greater good. The desert keeps secrets. The Mojave Preserve stretches for 1.6 million acres, most of it empty. Hikers cross the ground where Building 7 stood without knowing what lies sealed beneath their feet. The concrete plug is 50 feet thick. The chambers will remain entombed until geology, not law, decides to reveal them. The case of the Mojave Industrial Complex stands as evidence of what isolation permits, what patriotism excuses, and what bureaucracy protects. Dr. Webb didn't create the conditions that made his experiments possible. He simply recognized them and exploited them with the methodical precision of a man who believed knowledge justified any cost. His journals, now archived at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, accessible by appointment with appropriate clearances, end with an entry dated September 4, 1944, the night Morrison escaped. Subject 41 has absconded. Security failure attributable to orderly's negligence. Remaining subjects evacuated to prevent discovery. Research concludes at 94% completion. Findings suggest human endurance exceeds previous estimates when survival instinct sufficiently engaged. Results will inform future protocols. Regret only that civilian oversight prevents full publication of methodology and results. History will vindicate this work when its contributions to victory become apparent. History has not vindicated him. But history hasn't forgotten him either. And that, perhaps, is the only justice the 47 men who entered Building 7 will ever receive.